The biting wind whipped across the desolate Yorkshire moors, mirroring the chill that had settled permanently in Elias Thorne's heart. He stood before the imposing gates of Thorne Manor, a Gothic monstrosity that had been his prison for far too long. Tonight, however, felt different. Tonight, the air crackled with a nervous energy, a premonition of the storm to come. Elias had always been the black sheep of the Thorne family, while his elder brother, Julian, excelled in the hallowed halls of Oxford, destined to inherit the family's sprawling law firm and their father's ruthless ambition. Elias found solace in the quiet rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind, the vibrant colors of the wildflowers that stubbornly clung to life on the unforgiving moorland. He was a painter, a dreamer, a soul utterly incompatible with the Thorne family's rigid expectations. His father, Alistair Thorne, a man carved from granite and fueled by an insatiable hunger for power, had never hidden his disappointment. A Thorne is a lawyer, Elias, not a dabbler in colors, he'd sneered countless times, his words like shards of ice piercing Elias's fragile spirit. His mother, Eleanor, beautiful and impeccably dressed, offered a subtler form of cruelty, a constant stream of passive-aggressive comments about his unconventional choices, his lack of ambition, his failure to live up to the Thorne legacy. Julian, ever the dutiful son, simply ignored him, treating Elias like an embarrassing stain on the family's pristine reputation. For years, Elias had endured their scorn, their condescension, their thinly veiled contempt. He lived in a small, neglected wing of the manor, his meager allowance barely enough to cover his art supplies. He ate meals in silence, the clinking of silverware a stark reminder of his isolation. He painted in secret, pouring his pain and longing onto canvases that would never see the light of day, fearing his father's inevitable ridicule. But something had shifted. A fire had been kindled within him, fueled by years of suppressed rage and a desperate yearning for validation. He had secretly entered a prestigious art competition, his work submitted under a pseudonym, fearing the repercussions if his family discovered his defiance. And he had won. Not just won, but swept the board. His paintings hailed as masterpieces, his talent undeniable. The prize money was substantial, enough to buy his freedom, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Thorne Manor. He had already made plans to move to London, to immerse himself in the vibrant art scene, to finally live life on his own terms. But he wasn't leaving quietly. He wasn't going to simply disappear. Another disappointment swept under the Thorne family rug. Tonight he was going to confront them. Tonight he was going to expose the hypocrisy that festered beneath their polished veneer. He clutched the letter confirming his win, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and stepped through the gates, ready to face the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. He knew this path would likely leave him completely alone, but he was willing to pay that price to finally be free. Resumo temático. Indivíduo constantemente menosprezado pela família por não corresponder às suas expectativas encontra sucesso independente, usando esse sucesso para expor a hipocrisia familiar e inverter a dinâmica de poder, inicialmente através da remoção do apoio financeiro e, posteriormente, revelando uma posição de autoridade sobre um membro da família, culminando em um afastamento definitivo e libertador. He found them in the drawing room, bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace. Alistair, as always, was perched in his leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. Eleanor sat opposite him, meticulously arranging a bouquet of lilies, her face an impassive mask. Julian stood by the window, silhouetted against the darkening sky, a book open in his hands, though Elias doubted he was reading. "Ah, Elias," Alistair said, his voice dripping with condescension, "decided to grace us with your presence. We were just discussing your future." Elias forced himself to meet his father's gaze. "My future is no longer a topic for discussion, father. It's mine to decide." Eleanor gave a delicate sniff. Such defiance. "Where is this coming from? Have you finally decided to take up a proper profession?" "I already have a profession, mother. I'm an artist." Julian chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "An artist? Please, that's hardly a profession. It's a hobby at best. A rather expensive one, I might add, considering who's been footing the bill." Elias's hand tightened around the letter in his pocket. "Not anymore. I won't be needing your generosity any longer." He pulled out the letter and held it out. "I won the Thorne Art Prize." Alistair raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been interest in his eyes. "The Thorne Art Prize? That's prestigious. Who won?" Elias took a deep breath. "I did, under the pseudonym E. Morland." Silence descended upon the room, thick and heavy. Alistair's expression shifted from mild interest to stunned disbelief. Eleanor's perfectly composed face cracked, revealing a glimpse of raw, unadulterated shock. Julian simply stared, his mouth agape. "Impossible!" Alistair finally sputtered. "You win the Thorne Art Prize? Don't be absurd. You're delusional. The letter speaks for itself, Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. The judges were unanimous. They called my work groundbreaking, visionary. He paused, letting the words sink in. They called me a genius. Eleanor recovered first. This is some kind of trick. You forged this, haven't you? Desperate for attention, as always. Believe what you want, Elias said, his anger rising. But it's true, and I'm leaving. I'm moving to London. I'm going to pursue my career without your interference, without your judgment. He paused, a sudden thought striking him. And speaking of your judgment, Julian, that internship at Sotheby's, the one you were so proud of, I hear the head curator, Mr. Davies, is quite the admirer of E. Moreland's work. He let the implication hang in the air. Julian's face paled. Alistair stood up, his face red with rage. You ungrateful wretch! Everything you have you owe to this family. You wouldn't be anything without us. That's where you're wrong, Father, Elias said, his voice now cold and hard. I am something. And I achieved it despite you, not because of you. And as for owing you anything, consider the debt repaid. He turned and walked towards the door, leaving his family reeling in his wake. As he reached the threshold, he paused, a final barb on his tongue. Oh, and Father, the winning painting. It's a portrait of you, titled The Tyrant. I trust it will find a prominent place in the gallery. He stepped out into the hallway, leaving the stunned silence behind him. The echo of his words the only sound in the grand, oppressive manner. The storm had truly begun. Resumo temático. Indivíduo constantemente menosprezado pela família por não corresponder às suas expectativas encontra sucesso independente, usando esse sucesso para expor a hipocrisia familiar e inverter a dinâmica de poder, inicialmente através da remoção do apoio financeiro e, posteriormente, revelando uma posição de autoridade sobre um membro da família, culminando em um afastamento definitivo e libertador. He didn't look back. Each footfall echoed the severance he craved. The grand hallway, once a symbol of his imprisonment, now seemed insignificant, a mere corridor leading to his liberation. He retrieved his meager belongings, packed neatly into a worn leather satchel, a silent testament to years of quiet endurance. The portrait of his father, the tyrant, a scathing critique rendered in oils and shadows, was already making its way to the prestigious gallery, its unveiling promising a scandal of epic proportions. The next morning dawned cold and grey, but for Elias the world felt vibrant with possibility. He boarded the train to London, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a soundtrack to his newfound independence. He found a small, affordable flat in a bohemian district, a far cry from the opulence of Thorn Manor, but infinitely more appealing. He threw himself into his work, painting with a fervour he had never experienced before. The city's energy fueled his creativity, and his canvases blossomed with life, colour and raw emotion. Weeks turned into months. Elias thrived in his newfound anonymity, his art gaining recognition and acclaim. Galleries clamoured for his work, critics lauded his talent, and collectors eagerly sought his paintings. He was no longer Elias Thorn, the disappointment, but E. Moreland, the visionary artist. He deliberately avoided any contact with his family, severing all ties to his past. He knew his success would eventually reach them, but he was determined to control the narrative, to let his art speak for itself. One evening, as he was preparing for his first solo exhibition, his phone rang. He hesitated, the caller ID displaying an unfamiliar number. Curiosity, however, got the better of him. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Elias? It's me, Julian." Elias's heart clenched. He hadn't spoken to his brother since that fateful night at Thorn Manor. "What do you want, Julian? We need to talk. It's about Father." Julian's voice was strained, laced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I have nothing to say to you or Father," Elias replied coldly. "Leave me alone." He started to hang up, but Julian's next words stopped him in his tracks. He's been arrested for embezzlement." Elias froze, the phone pressed tightly against his ear. "Embezzlement? What are you talking about?" "He's been siphoning funds from the firm for years. The authorities have been investigating for months, and they finally have enough evidence to charge him. The scandal, it's catastrophic. The firm is collapsing. Our reputation is ruined." Julian's voice cracked. "That internship I had lined up at Sotheby's? Gone. All gone." Elias remained silent, processing the information. A part of him felt a perverse satisfaction, a sense of karmic justice. But another part, the part that still remembered the man who had once held him on his knee and told him stories of faraway lands, felt a pang of something akin to pity. "Why are you telling me this, Julian?" Elias asked, his voice softening slightly. Because you're the only one who can help. Father needs a lawyer, a good one. And I know you have connections now. You're successful, respected, you're E. Moreland. There was a note of pleading in Julian's voice, a desperate plea for help from the brother he had always dismissed. Elias hesitated. He had vowed to sever all ties with his family, to leave the past behind. But could he truly turn his back on them now, when they were at their lowest? He knew Alistair didn't deserve his help, but Julian was different. He had always been weak, easily swayed by his father's influence, but perhaps beneath the veneer of arrogance, there was still a glimmer of humanity. "I'll think about it," Elias said finally, "but don't expect any miracles." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had finally achieved the success he had always craved, but now that success came with a heavy price. He had the power to help his family, to save them from ruin. But doing so would mean confronting his past, reopening old wounds, and potentially jeopardizing his newfound freedom. The storm, it seemed, was far from over. He looked at the portrait of his father, now framed and ready for the exhibition. He knew what he had to do. He would offer help, but on his terms, terms that would ensure Alistair Thorne could never again wield power over him or anyone else. The power dynamics were about to shift, irrevocably. Resumo temático. Indivíduo constantemente menosprezado pela família por não corresponder às suas expectativas encontra sucesso independente, usando esse sucesso para expor a hipocrisia familiar e inverter a dinâmica de poder, inicialmente através da remoção do apoio financeiro e, posteriormente, revelando uma posição de autoridade sobre um membro da família, culminando em um afastamento definitivo e libertador. Elias stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his flat. The city lights blurred behind him, mimicking the turmoil within. He saw not the celebrated artist, but the boy who had yearned for his father's approval, the young man who had silently endured his family's scorn. Could he truly bury that past, or was he destined to be forever defined by it? He spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty. He cancelled appointments, postponed the exhibition, and retreated into the sanctuary of his studio. He stared at the tyrant, his father's portrait, searching for answers in the harsh lines and unforgiving shadows. He saw not only a cruel and domineering man, but also a figure consumed by his own ambition, trapped by the expectations he had imposed upon himself. Finally, he made a decision. He called Julian back. "I'll help," he said, his voice flat, "but on my terms." "Anything," Julian pleaded. Just help us. I'll need complete access to the firm's financial records," Elias stated. "I want to know everything, every transaction, every hidden account." There was a pause. "Father won't like that," Julian said hesitantly. "Then he can rot in jail," Elias retorted. "This is my only condition. Take it or leave it." Julian relented. All right, I'll arrange it." Elias spent the next week poring over the firm's accounts, his artist's eye surprisingly adept at spotting irregularities. He uncovered a complex web of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and fraudulent transactions. The extent of Alistair's embezzlement was staggering, far exceeding the initial estimates. He also discovered something else, something far more insidious, evidence that Julian had been complicit in his father's crimes, albeit unknowingly. Alistair had been using Julian's accounts for some of the transactions, claiming they were for legitimate business expenses. Julian, trusting his father implicitly, had signed the documents without question. Elias confronted Julian with his findings. Julian was devastated, his face etched with disbelief and betrayal. I didn't know," he stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "I swear, Elias, I had no idea." Elias studied his brother's face, searching for any sign of deception. He saw only genuine remorse and despair. He believed him. "Father used you, Julian," Elias said softly. "He used your trust against you." "What am I going to do?" Julian wailed. "I'm ruined. I'll be implicated. I'll go to jail too." Elias sighed. "That depends on what you're willing to do now." He laid out his plan. It was risky, audacious, and required Julian's complete cooperation. It involved exposing Alistair's crimes to the authorities, providing them with all the evidence Elias had uncovered, and implicating Julian as an unwitting accomplice. In exchange, Elias would use his influence and resources to ensure Julian received a lighter sentence and would help him rebuild his life after the scandal subsided. Julian hesitated. "Betray father? I don't know if I can." "He already betrayed you, Julian," Elias said, his voice hardening. "He sacrificed you for his own greed. You have a choice. Continue to be his victim or take control of your own destiny." Julian finally agreed. Together, they went to the authorities and presented the evidence. Alistair was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud, his empire crumbling around him. The scandal rocked the Thorne family to its core, shattering their carefully constructed facade of wealth and respectability. As Alistair sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, Elias visited him. "Why, Elias?" Alistair snarled, his eyes filled with venom. "Why would you do this to your own family?" "You stopped being my family a long time ago, Father," Elias said coldly. "You taught me that success is all that matters, that power is the only thing nothing worth pursuing. I simply learned your lessons too well." He paused, a flicker of something akin to sadness in his eyes. "But I also learned something you never did, that true power lies not in wealth or status, but in integrity and compassion. And that's something you'll never understand." He turned to leave, but Alistair stopped him with a final desperate plea. "Elias, please, help me. I'm your father." Elias turned back, his face devoid of emotion. "You were my father," he said softly, "but you chose to be a tyrant, and tyrants always fall." He walked away, leaving Alistair alone in his cell, the weight of his sins crushing him. He had finally broken free from the chains of his past, but the victory felt hollow. He had exposed the hypocrisy of his family, but in doing so he had also destroyed them. He was free, but he was also alone. He returned to his studio, the city lights beckoning him. He picked up his brush, ready to face the blank canvas, ready to create a new future, one defined not by the expectations of his family, but by the desires of his own heart. The exhibition would go on, but now it would tell a different story, a story of betrayal, redemption, and the enduring power of the human spirit. He knew it was possible to forgive, but forgetting was a different matter. He would carry the scars of his past, but they would serve as a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he had to go. And as he painted, he realized that he wasn't entirely alone. He had his art, his freedom, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had finally stood up to the tyrant who had haunted his life for so long. He was E. Moreland, and his story was just beginning.